iPhone screens are kind of small. If we're building a desktop app, we have a lot of screen real estate to work with, and we can build an application that has multiple windows that the user can interact with. But on an iPhone, we just have this really small screen and one window that is going to take up the entire screen. And within our application, we'll have to transition between different pages within that app. In iOS, this is all managed through UIViewControllers. So in this video, I want to introduce UIviewControllers and demonstrate how you can navigate between different pages in your application. I've just created a brand new iOS application and I'm running it on the iPhone 11 simulator, and immediately I'm greeted with this white view. And it's important to know how we got here, what steps were taken by the application to present this view to us. And basically, when the app runs, a new window is created, and on an iPhone, there's only ever really going to be one window. On an iPad, we can have multi-window applications, and on desktop, Mac apps, we can definitely have lots of windows. But on an iOS app, we're generally just going to have that one window, and that window needs to have a view controller in order to actually present anything. So when the app's main window loads up, it looks in the storyboard to see what the initial view controller is. And by default, it's this view controller right here. And if I open up this panel on the right here, we can see that this is the initial view controller. So the application goes to the main storyboard, gets the initial view controller, creates a new instance of this view controller, and then takes that view controller's view and puts it straight into the main window. This is the root view controller that's created when the app is created, and anything inside this view is what we see. And this is all done for us automatically behind the scenes. We get all of this for free so that we can just focus on adding UI to this view controller and creating other view controllers within our app. So right now, this is just an iOS app with a single view controller, which means that we're really just going to have that single screen. But if I open up the simulator again, and I'm going to navigate to the News app here, we can see that most applications are built out of multiple screens, multiple pages. So down here I can click any of these buttons and I get presented with a new page. I can click on a story and that's a new page. And all of this is managed from view controllers. So view controllers manage how we transition from one view to another, and they manage all of the logic that goes along with setting up the user interface and responding to user input. So in order to get an experience like this, we need multiple view controllers that we can transition between. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to make an app where we can push on different buttons and different view controllers will get presented that display different colors. So I could tap on a blue button and I'd see a blue view controller. I could tap a pink button and I'd see a pink view controller. So I'm going to start by adding some buttons to this page. So just to review, every view controller has a main view, and this is the thing we see. We can't see a view controller, we see a view controller's view. And any subview that we put inside the view controller's view will be part of that view hierarchy that we can see. So here I have my app, it has that single screen, that single view controller's view that we see, and within that I have 3 buttons that I've created. Now when I tap on one of these buttons, I want to show a brand new screen that displays just the color that's in that button. First, I'm going to do everything programmatically, and then I'm going to show you how to do it through the storyboard. So I'm creating a brand new instance of a UIViewController. I'm setting that new UIViewController's view's background color to be pink, and then right here, this is the important part, I'm presenting that new view controller. So one view controller can present a brand new view controller and can specify if they want that transition to the new view controller to be animated, and then we can also pass in an optional completion block here if we want to know once the presentation has happened. So if I run this application now, and tap on the pink button, I see a brand new pink view controller presented. And by default in iOS 13, when we present a new view controller, it gets presented as this page sheet where it doesn't actually take up the entire screen. We can still see the first view controller in the back there, and we can actually get rid of this just by dragging the view down like that. Now usually we never create an instance of UIViewController itself. Usually we create a subclass of UIViewController like we have here, and then create an instance of that. because we're very limited here in any custom behavior we can add to the view controller. I can change its view's background color, but that's about it. So I'm going to create a subclass of UIViewController, and then I can add any custom behavior and custom elements that I want to that view controller much more easily. So now I have a color view controller, which is a subclass of UIViewController, and now in this class I can add any custom behavior, custom elements. Right now I've added a label that I'm centering in the view, and I'm going to change the view's background color to be whatever color is specified, and then set the label's text to actually say that color in English. So by default I'm just going to leave that as white. And then in my other view controller, the one that's going to present this, I can create a new instance of this color view controller. I'm going to leave the background color for now, and then present that view controller. So right now, just to test this is working, I'm going to make sure that I actually see the white view controller and that it says the word white. So yep, there we go. I present it and I now get that label. In my last example, I changed the other view controller's view manually, but generally you won't want to do this. You don't want one view controller to modify another view controller's views directly. Instead, we should pass the other view controller any data that it needs, but let each view controller manage its own views directly. So in my color view controller, I'm going to add a method that any other object in the app can call to set the color and the name for this view controller. So back in my other view controller, I can now call this method like that. And now when I present the pink view controller, it should show pink background with the word pink, which is great. Now, if we go back to the color view controller, you'll notice that the method that sets the color and the name is completely separate from where the label's text and the view's background color actually get set. And this is because this method will get called before this view controller's views are all set up and ready to be changed. So at this point in time, really all we can do is set up some Swift properties, and then later on when the views are actually ready to be set up and ready to be changed, we can use those values to change the background color and change the text. So you'll find that this Viewdidload method that exists in every view controller is where you'll put any of your setup code for any of your views. And in this case, it's where I'm going to set up the text for the label and the color for the background. Now, this example is working really well. I can present the new view controller and then I can dismiss it like that. There will be times when we want our new view controllers to actually take up the entire screen. And to do that, all we have to do is change a property on the view controller before we actually present it. So every view controller has a property called Modal presentation style. And by default, it's set to automatic. So in cases like this, it will be presented as that page sheet. And we can change it to any one of these values you see here, including page sheet down here, but the one that we'll want is full screen. So if I change that to full screen now and go to present that view controller, we should see that it takes up the entire screen. So the other view controller still exists, it's still in the background there, but as far as the user's concerned, this is all there is to focus on. And we can also change another property called Modal transition style, which allows us to change the way the animation happens. So right now it's covering vertical, coming up from the bottom, but we could change that to something like flip horizontal, so that when we tap this button, it actually flips around. And this was more of a popular animation like 8 years ago. This isn't really used much today, so I'm just gonna get rid of this. Presenting from the bottom to the top is pretty good. So you'll notice now when it's presented as a full screen view controller, I can't actually dismiss this anymore. If I drag from the top, nothing happens. And this is on purpose. This is how the user expects this kind of view controller to work. So we need a different way of dismissing this view controller now. And usually this will be done through a button. So the user taps like a done button or something and the view controller just goes away. And we'll have to write some code to actually do that dismissal. So just like the view controller here is presenting the other view controller, the presenting view controller will also have to dismiss that view controller later on. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so now when I present the pink view, I have this done button up here and the colors aren't great, but if I tap this done button, it dismisses that view controller. And all I had to do to get that working was create a new button and add it to the view controller. And then in this done action, when the user taps the done button, I'm calling the dismiss method. And the dismiss method can be called either from the presented view controller or the presenting view controller, which is this view controller. And it's this view controller's responsibility, the one that presented the other one, to actually dismiss that view controller. So when we're calling dismiss from this view controller, from the color view controller, it's actually telling the other view controller that presented it to take care of the dismissal. But the end result is that we get this done button that actually dismisses that view controller, which is great. So this is how things look when we do it programmatically, but we can also set up new view controllers in the storyboard. And to do that, we can just head over to the main storyboard, click the plus button up here, and look for a UIViewController. And then we can just drag that in. There we go. So I now have two view controllers in this storyboard, and then I can set this up just as I would any other view controller. So I'm going to drag in a label. I'm going to set this up the same way I did the other one programmatically. So I'm going to put a label in the middle. So I've got the button and the label, but in order to create outlets and actions for these, I'm going to need a subclass of UIViewController. So I could use this subclass right here, but to demonstrate these things separately, I'm going to create another subclass of UIViewController to handle the interface builder version of this stuff. So I'm going to call this color2 viewcontroller. In the storyboard, I have to select this new view controller that I just created, make sure it's the view controller that's selected and nothing else. Go over to the identity inspector, and then here you can see what the class is, what the current class for the view controller is. And in this case, it's the default UIViewController class. We don't want it to be that, we want it to be the new one I just created, which is color2 viewcontroller. So once I do that, I'll be able to open up the assistant editor and start dragging in outlets and actions here. So there's the label and there's the button, and I'm just going to copy some of the code from the other view controller to get this working in the same way. So this is set up similarly to the last one, except I don't have to deal with any of that code that sets up the label or the button, because that's all being done in the storyboard. So now, when I click on the orange button, I want to present the view controller from the storyboard instead of the programmatic one. Now before, when I was doing this, I could just create a brand new instance of that view controller, and since everything was being done programmatically, this just worked. But now I need to tell my application to create the instance of the view controller from the storyboard, because it needs to be this version of the view controller that has the label and the button already set up. And this isn't too difficult to do, it's just a little bit different than the other way. So instead of instantiating the view controller this way, we ask the storyboard to do it for us. So there's a method on the current storyboard called InstantiateViewController, and we can pass it an identifier. So if we go back to the storyboard and select the view controller again, the new one that we want to create, and we go over to the identity inspector again, we can give this view controller an identifier. So I'm just going to call this color VC, just any string will do. And then back in the view controller, I can put this in here, and now this line of code will create a new view controller based on the one in the storyboard. And this is an optional, so we could just wrap this in a guard statement to unwrap it. And then we can just call the rest of the code as we did before. So we can set the color, the presentation style, and then we can present it. So if I try running this, I'm going to run into an error. And the error is going to be UIViewController has no member set, and it's basically telling us that we can't call this method on the view controller. And everything works fine in this method, but right here it's not allowing us to do that. And that's because the storyboard method returns the view controller as a type of UIViewController instead of the more specific type color view controller. So we actually need to cast this as the color2 view controller so that we can call the specific methods on it. And the safest way to do this is to use the optional as type. So by saying as question mark, we're going to try and cast this view controller as a color view controller. And if that cast fails, then we'll get nil, and in this case it will just return right here. But if this view controller being instantiated from the storyboard is a color, it's actually color2 view controller, it's that new one, then the rest of this code can run. We'll set the color, and in this case I want it to be orange, and it should just be presented in the exact same way. So let's go orange. and run this. So now if I select orange, we get a nice orange view, and then if I select that button, it gets dismissed. So if I select the pink button, I'm creating a brand new view controller from code and setting it all up in code. But if I do it from the orange button, I'm actually setting up a different view controller from the storyboard, but everything else acts in the same way. Now there's one more way of doing this that I want to show you, and that's using something called a segue. So if I select this blue button down here, and I want to present this view controller, the color view controller, I can just right click and drag from the blue button and drop it directly on the view controller, and this will create a segue for me. And before it actually creates the segue, I get these different options, show detail. The two options that we care about most as iPhone developers is the show segue and the present modally segue. So the show segue is kind of the default basic segue that gets created, where we don't really get any options. We just tell it to show it in the default way, so we get the default animation, the default presentation style, which in this case happens to be that page sheet where, like we can see on the right here, we'll be able to, once it's running, drag down to get rid of that view. If we want more control, we can change this from show to present modally, and then we can say, well, maybe we want it to take up the full screen, and maybe we want that animation to flip horizontally or something. But these are the different options we have. So for the most part, I would just leave it as show, unless you want to take more control and add some more custom behavior. So we now have this segue, and without writing any code, I can run this application. If I tap on blue, it's going to present that view controller. But I haven't actually set a background color or a label here, so we're getting a background color of clear and the label's text is set to nothing. So we need to get a reference to this view controller before it's presented. And when we're using a segue as of iOS 13, we can just create a segue action. So if I right click on the segue here, it's this thing between the two view controllers, I can drag into my initial view controller. So this is the one where the action's coming from, the one that's actually presenting it. And I can create this segue action. So I'm just going to name this show blue, and then head back over to the view controller. And the way this works is that it expects us to return a new instance of the view controller that is going to be presented. So in this case, it's just the color2 view controller. But what this means is that we can get a reference to this by creating a variable and then return that reference. And then in between getting the reference and returning it, we can actually do whatever we want. So we can, you know, in the middle here, write as much code as we want. Now it's complaining because the view controller isn't optional, so I can wrap this in a guard statement and return nil. And then I'm also going to get rid of this line here, because if I wanted to present this in the full screen way, I can do that through the storyboard now. So there's no point in writing the code if I can do it through the storyboard. And we definitely don't need this line of code anymore because it's being presented through the segue. So really, we just need the custom code, which is setting the color and the title. And now if I click on the blue button, we get that blue view, and because I didn't change the presentation style, it's that sheet that I can drag down. So any of these ways will work for presenting a new view controller, but if you have the option of writing more code or doing it through the storyboard and writing less code, I usually favor the writing less code option. So I think segues are definitely a good option when you can do things through the storyboard. So I want to head back over to the News app for a second and show you the different ways that things are being navigated. So at the bottom here, we have this tab bar collection, and every time I select one of these buttons, I get a brand new page. I'm in a different section of the application. But these are all just different view controllers. And then if I click on a story like this one at the top, it comes over from the right, and I get this navigation bar at the top where I can see a title, and I get this back button that I can select. And these are two more types of ways that we can navigate between different view controllers in our application. And I'm going to show you those two now. So the first one I want to take a look at is the navigation controller, where we get the navigation bar at the top. And to implement this in an application is really easy. So I'm going to select my initial view controller here, and I'm going to go up to the top and select Editor, Embed in Navigation Controller. And when I select that, we get this navigation controller, which now becomes the initial view controller for my application. So when the app loads, this is the initial root view controller. the navigation controller has a special type of relationship segue so that it presents this view controller, my other view controller, inside of itself, basically. So this view controller now gets this nice title bar, and it can use some of the default behaviors of a navigation controller. So let's run this app and see how this looks now. So similar to before, we're immediately presented with this screen, but we now have this navigation bar, and here we can present some custom titles. And then if I tap on the pink button, I still get that view controller being presented in the way it was before. But if I tap on this blue one, because I'm using a segue and I'm allowing it to be the show segue, this is just the default behavior for the current way that things are being presented in the app. So if I'm in a navigation controller, it's going to push it onto the screen. And by default, if it's pushed on to the navigation controller, I get this back button at the top just for free. So with the pink one, I get no navigation bar, nothing. But with the blue one, with that default behavior, I get the back button. And these things can all be done programmatically as well, but I'm just going to demonstrate it through the storyboard for now. So the next thing I want to do is actually populate these navigation bars with some titles. So on my first page, I can just set this to be a static title. By selecting the bar and then coming over to the right here and setting the title to be something like colors, because I always just want that to be colors. But in this view controller, I want the title to change depending on the color that's selected. So if I select the color 2 view controller, when I set the labels text to be the name of the color, I can also set the title of the view controller to be the name of the color. And now the navigation bar will take whatever text is in there and present it in the title. So here I have colors, but in this one I have blue. And if I presented other colors through the navigation controller, it would take those names. So this is a really common way of navigating between different pages in an application. The next one is that tab bar controller, and you see this in so many different applications, especially the social media ones like Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. They all have those tab bars at the bottom, and that's how you navigate between like your profile page and the newsfeed page and things like that. And it's very similar to a navigation controller. I'm going to select my navigation controller now, and I'm going to go back up to Editor, Embed In, and I'm going to select the tab bar controller. I'm going to zoom out a little bit now. And I can see now the initial view controller is that tab bar controller. And my tab bar controller contains, through a segue, my navigation controller, which contains my initial view controller. So there's now multiple levels here. But I can see that I get this tab bar button at the bottom appear for the pages that are part of that tab bar hierarchy. And the tab bar controller can contain multiple view controllers. That's kind of the point of a tab bar controller. We can select different view controllers just by tapping the buttons at the bottom. So I'm going to demonstrate this by dragging in another Uiviewcontroller. So I just have a plain Uiviewcontroller here, and I'm going to right click and drag from the tab bar controller to that new view controller. And I can create that new relationship segue, that view controller's relationship segue. Now I can see that there's two tab bar buttons at the bottom here. So this button will present this new blank view controller, but if I were to select this button, it would select the navigation controller that I saw before. And right now, if I zoom in, it just says item on each button and there's a square at the top. That's not super interesting. But if we go to each screen, so I'm going to go to the navigation one. This is the the multiple colors screen. I could change this, just maybe I'll type in colors, and I'll change the image to be, this can actually be any 30 by 30 point image, but we can choose from any of these system images, and that's a little bit easier. So I'm going to use, I don't know, maybe a pencil there. And then for this view controller, I'm going to make this actually present a random color every single time it's presented. So I'm just going to call this random, and I'm going to select the image to be, is there a random image? No. Arrows. There we go. So there I can see is actually still a square over here because I selected the wrong image. So it's not the selected image I want to select. It's the bar item image. So make sure that you're modifying these properties, not these ones. So the image here, I want it to be that pencil. There we go, and it updated here. So now if I run this application, we should be able to see that tab bar controller right there. So immediately it selected the colors, the list of colors, and within here is still a navigation controller. So if I select blue, I'm still getting that navigation behavior that I can go forwards and backwards with. But if I select this random one, I get the other view controller, which right now is just blank. So I can navigate at the bottom here between the tab bar controls, and I can also navigate within this by using the navigation controller, or I can even just present a whole other view controller on top of everything. Now, this navigation controller and the tab bar controller are both subclasses of Uiviewcontroller. So right here I can see it's a UI tab bar controller that is actually a subclass of Uiviewcontroller. And a lot of the time just using these classes directly is good enough for our application. But if we want any further custom behavior within the navigation controller or the tab bar controller, we can also create a subclass of that. So I've created a subclass of the UI tab bar controller here, just called tab view controller. And if I go back to the storyboard, I can select the tab bar controller and say that this is actually an instance of my custom tab bar view controller. And this isn't always necessary, but it does allow us to take a little bit more control over how the tab bar controller actually works. So by default, we're going to have the first view controller selected, which in this case is the colors view controller. But if I wanted by default it to select the random one on the right, or maybe I have multiple ones down there and I always want it to select the middle one, then we can subclass this and we can override one of the properties. So there's selected index. And by default, this is going to be 0. That's the first view controller there. But if I set this to 1, then every time we start up the app, it's going to show the other view controller, the random view controller in this case. So it's just started up and it selects random by default. So anytime you need more custom behavior, you can just create subclasses of these classes. Now, this random view controller, this random color view controller, isn't actually doing anything right now, and I want to implement this to show you a couple more things. So first of all, I'm going to have to create a subclass of UIViewController. So I've created a random color view controller that in the Viewdidload method, I'm creating a random color using random RGB values and then setting the view controller's view to be that color. So then in the storyboard, all I have to do is connect that view controller over here, the random view controller. I have to make sure that it's an instance of my random color view controller. And now if I run the app, we should see that the view is now a random color. So there we go, it's a random green color. And now if I select the colors tab and go back to random, it's still that same color. And if I rerun the application, it's a new random color, but every time I switch between the view controllers, the color always stays the same. And this isn't the behavior I wanted. I wanted it to be random every single time that I went to this view controller. So the reason this isn't working the way I want it to is because Viewdidload is a method that only gets called the first time we present a view controller. So the very first time this view controller is presented, Viewdidload gets called, and I can run any code that affects the interface of this view controller. But every other time that it's presented, that method doesn't get called. But there are other methods in the view controller that we can override that do get called at different times. And one of those is view will appear. So if I override this method, I always have to make sure to call the superclasses version of this method. And basically this method will get called right before the view is presented, right before it appears every single time. So if I take this code out of here and put it in this method instead, when we switch between this view and switch back to it, the color always changes. So if you need something to happen every single time the user sees the view, you might want to put that in the view will appear rather than the Viewdidload. So those are some of the main ways you can navigate between screens in your application. You'll find that most applications use a mixture of these depending on what kind of data needs to be presented to the user. So take some time to play around with all of these techniques and stay tuned for more videos on iOS development.